This is the Rational Reminder Podcast, a weekly reality check on sensible investing and financial decision-making from two Canadians. We are hosted by me, Benjamin Felix, and Cameron Passmore, portfolio managers at PWL Capital.
So welcome to episode 177, and this is a very, very serious and unbelievable conversation. I think, Ben, you'll agree with me. And this guest, Dr. Anna Lembke, joined us, and a past guest, Dr. Hirsch Sheffrin, referred us to Dr. Lembke, and she's the author of Dopamine Nation, Finding Balance in the Age of Indulgence, which is a book that we've mentioned a couple of times. And all I can say is, wow, very good book and unbelievable conversation.
Yeah, the ideas are phenomenal and important. You said that at the end of the conversation with Anna, that was an important discussion, and I think that's a really good way to describe it. Just through the conversation, you can start to realize you start to realize how weak, in a lot of ways, humans are when we're not aware of what our brains are compelling us to do.
And
that was one of the big takeaways for me. And there are so many sources of quick and easy dopamine in the way that the world is today, and it is what it is. We have cell phones, we have fast food. We have porn, like it's right there, and that can be really problematic. But one of the solutions is being mindful of it.
and being aware of it. So she does a very good job of outlining all of that. And technology, as you said, is just accelerating this, where it is literally everywhere and always with you. So Anna is the currently professor and medical director of the Stanford Addiction Medicine Fellowship in Neurology, and a diplomat of the American Board of Addictive Medicine. She was also one of the first in the medical community to sound the alarm regarding opioid overprescription back in 2016 with her book, Drug Dealer, MD. She received her undergrad degree in humanities from Yale and her medical degree from Stanford. Anything to add, Ben?
No, I think this is it's definitely tangential to the financial topics that we often cover. We did tie in some personal finance and investing to the conversation, but I think for anybody who's living their life and making important decisions, which everybody is by definition, I think this is an extremely important conversation.
So with that, here's our conversation with Dr. Anna Lembke. Dr. Anna Lembke, welcome to the Rational Reminder Podcast.
Thank you for having me.
And off the top, I want to congratulate you and thank you for your recent book, Dopamine Nation. I thought it was terrific and a very important read at this time.
Well, thank you for that.
So off the top, can you describe, just so we're all on the same level playing field, what dopamine actually is?
Dopamine is a molecule in the brain that has different functions, but one of its very important functions is the experience of pleasure, motivation, and reward. And when it is released in a part of the brain called the reward pathway, we experience pleasure. And it's also the molecule that's very important to the development of the disease of addiction. It's changes in dopamine levels over time that are commensurate with the disease of addiction in the human brain.
How does dopamine influence our behaviors on a daily basis?
Well, I mean, we are evolutionarily designed to approach pleasure and avoid pain, and that's what's kept us alive in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger. And pleasure and pain work very much like a balance. So imagine that there's a balance in your brain, like a teeter-totter in a kid's playground. And when we do something pleasurable or ingest something pleasurable, that balance tips slightly to the side of pleasure, and dopamine is released in our brain's reward pathway. But one of the overriding rules governing that pleasure-pain balance is that it wants to remain level. It doesn't want to be tipped for very long to the side of pleasure or pain. And the brain will work very hard to restore a level balance, or what's called homeostasis. And it does that by downregulating dopamine and dopamine transmission right after we get a release of dopamine in the reward pathway. But the really key piece is that it doesn't just downregulate dopamine levels back to tonic baseline. it actually decreases dopamine transmission to below baseline. So there's a dopamine deficit state that occurs in response to a dopamine elevation before dopamine levels go back to baseline. And with the balance, one way to think about this is that you have these little gremlins hopping on the pain side of the balance to bring it level again, but they like it on the balance, so they stay on until it's tipped an equal and opposite amount to the side of pain before jumping off and before homeostasis being restored. And that's a really key piece of how pleasure and pain work, that with every pleasure, there's essentially a pain. It's often so subtle that it's outside of our conscious awareness, but it's still operating in the brain.
Wow. So is more dopamine a good thing?
Well, I wouldn't say it's an unqualified good thing or an unqualified bad thing. It's sort of relative. But what is true is that our primitive brains have not evolved for the enormous amount of dopamine that technology has allowed for in the modern age.
Wow.
Not only are we surrounded by an overwhelming abundance of highly reinforcing drugs and behavior, but technology has also made traditional drugs much more potent than they were. And the fundamental difference between things that are highly addictive and those that, are just a little bit addictive is how much dopamine they release in the brain's reward pathway. Things that are highly addictive release a whole lot of dopamine. And again, it really kind of sends our brains reeling because we're not adapted for that. We're adapted for a world of scarcity where you have to really work hard to get that tiny little bit of reward that's going to release a tiny little bit of dopamine. Now, just sitting on your couch, you can ingest or engage in a highly reinforcing drug or behavior that leads to an explosion of dopamine, that leads to this intense downregulation of dopamine as our brains try to compensate.
Wow.
There's all this stigma around addiction. Is it normal in the world that we live in with all of these dopamine-rich activities around us? Is it normal to be addicted to something?
It's normal in the sense that we're all vulnerable to addiction today. So if you look at epidemiologically, populations that were vulnerable to addiction historically. So addiction has been around forever, since the beginning of time. There are reports of people who are not able to use a variety of intoxicants in moderation. But what we see today is an ever-growing number of people becoming addicted, including in populations that were previously thought immune, like older people and women. For example, the last 2 decades have seen an 85% increase in the number of women who have an alcohol addiction, and a 50% increase in older people with an alcohol addiction. Deaths due to addiction are increasing globally, and 50% of those deaths are occurring in people under the age of 50. And minor addictions are sort of an everyday common occurrence now, even if it's just an addiction to technology and our smartphones. So I do think that, in a sense, addiction has become a normal part of living in the modern world. Not that it's good. I mean, normal implies that it's good, and addiction, inherent in that word, is that it's a form of psychopathology.
So I get the technology aspect and how that's made it easier to access addictive stuff like social media, sitting on your couch. Why do you think other addictive behaviors, like you mentioned alcoholism in women, why are behaviors like that increasing?
Well, when I think about sort of the 4 fundamental properties that make anything addictive, I think about access, which you've already talked about, but also quantity, potency, and novelty. Quantity is really huge. The more drug we have on hand, the more we are likely to use, and then the more likely we are to get addicted. And again, this goes hand in hand with access. But we are living in a day and age when technology has allowed massive production of all kinds of drugs, and we have new digital drugs that never run out, right? So Facebook and TikTok, they're never ending. They're endless. Then you think about potency. Technology has made traditional drugs more potent, whether it's cannabis or nicotine products or alcohol products. But also potency is increased by combining drugs. So that's a very old trick. For example, people who get addicted to opioids often combine heroin with Xanax to increase potency over time as they develop tolerance. And we see that very same thing online on social media. So I'm a big American Idol fan, but they've now gamified American Idol. It's not just a singing show, it's a singing competition. And they figured out exactly how to create these cliffhangers so that I tune in for the next episode. And there are so many examples of that. Social media combined with beautiful faces, combined with video games, combined with gambling, combined with sex. It's all a way to increase potency. And then, of course, the delivery mechanism makes it more potent too. The medium itself, the smartphone itself, is enhancing, rewarding. Screens itself are kind of like primitive fires. We're drawn to them, except now we're sitting by ourselves instead of sitting in a group. And then finally, novelty is really key. Dopamine is very sensitive to new things coming our way, including, frankly, aversive stimuli. So not just pleasurable stimuli can release dopamine, but also highly aversive stimuli if they're novel or new. And what the novelty does, it means that it really engages our search and explore function of our brains. We keep looking for that next new cool thing. And of course, AI has engineered social apps to suggest to us one more thing to click or download or watch. And also novelty means that people who maybe aren't or weren't addicted to traditional recreational drugs like nicotine, cannabis, and alcohol now might find a drug that is just perfect for them. Their lock and key, like a video game or a social media app. Because people are different and do have different drugs of choice, but there are so many drugs now that we're all liable to become addicted.
Unreal. This is just
I know,
like reading,
Cameron, you're shaking your head.
like
I
reading
feel
your book.
badly. I'm sorry to say all this, but I say it sort of, with optimism and hopefulness. I do think that by having these conversations, we're going to figure it out, but we have to start having the conversations and recognize, how drugified our world has become and how, in essence, how addicted we're all becoming.
So can addiction ever be a positive thing?
So I think inherent in the word addiction is a negative connotation, which I think we should preserve. Addiction does imply some kind of psychopathology or maladaptive, habit. It's not just a benign habit. It's not just an interest or a passion or a fixation. It's really crossed that line into maladaptive, unhealthy use. And the way that we define addiction is just simply the continued compulsive use of a substance or behavior despite harm to self and or others. Oftentimes when we're diagnosing addiction in the field of addiction medicine or psychiatry, we talk about the 4 C's: control, compulsion, cravings, and consequences. So when we're using our drug more than we planned, when we're compulsively ruminating about using or hiding the drug, when we have intrusive thoughts of using our drug, that's craving, or even physiologic craving, which can happen, which feels like a sudden sweaty, gut-wrenching urge to use. And then finally, continued use despite consequences, when it's starting to interfere with our relationships, with our work, with our studies, with our values, right? I've heard people say addiction is that thing we do and lie about, which I think is really a nice kind of way to think about it too. Things that we're doing that we're ashamed of and wouldn't want other people to find out about.
We've mentioned social media. Is it addictive in the same way that something traditionally known as addictive, like cigarettes or cocaine, are addictive?
Yeah, I contend that all of these behavioral or process addictions, which are addictions which involve a behavior rather than involving a drug, are really the same as drug addiction. They work on the same common dopamine reward pathway. They follow the same life trajectory. People usually start out for 2 reasons, one of 2 reasons: having fun or to solve a problem. If it works for them for either of those reasons, they use repeatedly over time, and they develop tolerance. They need more and more to get the same effect. Then they're using habitually, daily or weekly. They're using in larger and larger quantities, and then they start experiencing consequences and then have trouble stopping even when they want to, and even when they recognize those consequences. And that's kind of the natural history of addiction. And that's true whether your addiction is sex, pornography, or cannabis, or shopping. It follows a very similar trajectory.
What causes gambling to be addictive?
Say that again?
What causes gambling to be addictive?
Well, gambling is, I mean, inherently addictive for a number of different reasons. First of all, it's a game, it's a competition. We're wired to play games and to enjoy playing games, and we're wired to compete with each other and want to win. And again, these can be highly adaptive traits if channeled in the right way. But what happens with gambling is that the monetary aspect kind of distills all of the joys of competition and gaming into this very essential component, which is highly potent and which releases a lot of dopamine and which can become very reinforcing for people who enjoy gaming and gambling, and especially once people get deep into it. And again, then they're kind of chasing that dopamine kind of pleasure pain balance where they get to a point where they're gambling so much that they're in a kind of chronic dopamine deficit state, that those gremlins are hanging out on the pain side of the balance. And now they need to keep gambling, not to feel good from winning, but just to not feel bad.
Wow.
For gambling, is it winning that causes the dopamine, or is it taking a risk that causes the dopamine to be released?
So it's both. And there are interesting studies showing that if you take, addicted gamblers and you study their brains compared to healthy controls, people who don't gamble, and then you have them both gamble in the same game, what you'll find is that dopamine is released in both the addicted gambler's brain and in the brain of a healthy control. But then if you measure dopamine levels when that individual is, and so that's true with winning, but if you measure dopamine levels when both of those individuals are losing, what you'll find is that in a healthy person who's not a gambler, dopamine levels will go back down to normal when they are losing. But in a gambler and someone who's addicted to gambling, they'll have an increase in dopamine even when they're losing. And in fact, you'll see the highest dopamine release when there's the highest risk. So when the chances of losing and winning are exactly equal, an addicted gambler will be having the highest release of dopamine, which is often why addicted gamblers will talk about something called loss chasing, where they want to win explicitly. They'll say they'll want to win, but in a way, the most intense pleasure can come when they're losing. These studies show that because it's the adrenaline and the excitement that they get, even when they're losing, that is also driving repeated gambling. The other thing that's fascinating to me about gamblers is that they'll talk about how it starts to be totally separate. The pleasure of gambling starts to be separate from the pleasure of winning. The pleasure of gambling starts to be just being in that headspace where they are gambling, which is really an alternate reality where they're not aware of anything else. And so for me, I sort of think about it the way I feel when I'm watching a really good Netflix binge series. Like I'm in a fantasy world, I'm in a separate world, and I don't want that episode to end because I don't want to leave that world. I think that's exactly what happens to compulsive gamblers. They enter the world of gambling. It's highly reinforcing. They experience non-self or self-forgetting, which we all crave. And then it doesn't really matter if they're winning or losing. What matters is that they can stay in the game.
Fascinating. And can any of those effects be extrapolated to people speculating in the stock market?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the stock market has become more like gambling than ever before. Again, you think of those four factors, it's more accessible. The quantity is nearly endless. There are sort of infinite things to bet on and infinite modes of betting. The potency is enormous, and it's made more by the graphs, the bells, the whistles, the flashing lights. The collective nature of gambling has made it highly potent because, of course, we are social creatures. We want to be in tribes. We release dopamine when we make human connections. And one of the ways that we feel connected is to experience the same emotion at the same time as other people. So
Wow.
when we're winning and other people are winning, we get a release of oxytocin, which is our love hormone, which directly binds to dopamine releasing hormones in a reward pathway, which then augments the dopamine and reward that we experience, not just because we're winning, but we're winning collectively. We're part of a tribe. And then, of course, there's novelty. There's, all the new different ways that we can gamble and things we can gamble on.
So it's like the perfect storm, what happened earlier this year with the meme stock craze, I guess.
Yeah, I think, that's right. Like Dogecoin and those other things. What's happening there is not just that people are making money, but there's a real tribal aspect to it. And then especially if that tribal aspect has a in your face insurgency quality to it, then it's even more exciting because it's the adrenaline that comes from opposing authority, or just being countercultural or being anti-authoritarian, which is also really exciting and which releases adrenaline and which releases dopamine.
If we step away from gambling, can earning more money from whatever means also be addictive?
When earning money is separated from the meaning of the work itself, it can become addicted. And by the way, that's happening in all aspects of labor today. Even, for example, something as seemingly altruistic as medicine, as being a doctor, has become kind of gamified and monetized in a way that separates it from the meaning of the work itself. And I'll just give you a small example. Starting about 15 or 20 years ago, I, in my job as a physician, started getting monthly printouts of how well I was doing in terms of what my RVU earning units were. That's a way of measuring how many patients I've seen and what I've billed for my institution. Versus how many RVU units I'm supposed to get in a given month. So I get a graph, and I still get this, and it has my target, and then it has my actual earnings. And of course, when I have a month that my actual earnings go above my target and I see that visually on the graph, I get a little jolt of dopamine. It's like, oh, cool, I'm above my target. And then, of course, in some ways that has incentivized me in the past. I'm mindful of it now, so I don't do it now. But, oh, what other ways can I kind of commodify my patience and this encounter so that I can be even more above my target, not just because it feels good to be above the target, but it turns out I get a bonus if I'm well above my target. So, here we've taken something that was really meant to be altruistic and about healing and made it, largely about money. And that's happened everywhere.
So linked to that, can working become addictive as well?
Working is vulnerable to the same problems of addiction as any other behavior. Again, look at access. We now have a 24/7 work week. It never ends, right? So we're constantly engaging in work and potentially turning it into an addictive behavior. You've got, along with access, again, quantity, the work is endless. We're never done. And I think all of us experience that now, where it's like, wow, no matter how much I work, I feel like I can never get to the end of my pile. And that then drives this kind of relentless seeking just to finish it, to get to that place of satisfaction of finishing, which we never get to. It's like the bottomless bowls on social media. Then you've got potency and novelty, and the way, as I just described, work has become divorced from the meaning of work itself. It's become gamified and monetized in a way that it can become highly reinforcing. One of the interesting statistics is that if you look at white collar workers, that is highly educated workers, in professions, are working more now than ever before, and have less leisure time than ever before. And that's probably largely because their work has become gamified, full of bonuses and incentives that keeps them in it. Whereas if you look at blue collar work, or people who have access to lower wage jobs that people with less education can get, those people are working less than ever, because that work is inherently often not rewarding. It's also separated from the meaning of the work itself. But not because it's gamified full of bonuses, but because, it's assembly line work, it's piecemeal work. People don't get to see the results of the end product. And, whereas in the 1950s, this is especially true for men, People working in low wage jobs worked about the same amount and had about the same amount of leisure time as people in high wage jobs. That's not true today. People in low wage jobs work less and have more leisure time, and people in high wage jobs are working more than ever before.
I'm starting to feel like the questions we should be asking are what isn't addictive. But I've got one more question on spending. Can spending money be addictive, or maybe how addictive can spending be?
Yeah, again, so what's fascinating to me again is this whole concept of drug of choice, how what's reinforcing for one person is not reinforcing for another. There's surprisingly not that much neuroscience on drug of choice, although we observe this all the time. But I can tell you that shopping is absolutely addictive for some people. And as I describe in my book, Dopamine Nation, I had a patient who got really addicted to online shopping, which is easy to do because, again, you've got access, you've got quantity, you've got potency. And he got to a point where he got into hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt buying things on Amazon, but he couldn't stop himself. So then he started to just buy things like keychains and mugs and sunglasses and returning them as soon as he got them because he just wanted to keep the cycle going. Very similar to people who are gambling and are losing, they just want to stay in that world. So for certain individuals, shopping has absolutely become a potent and potential addiction.
I joke that we should maybe be asking what isn't addictive. Maybe another version of that question is what's the most unexpected addiction you've ever seen in your practice?
So I did have a patient who was in recovery from a very severe alcohol addiction, and she really struggled even in recovery. Addiction can be a terrible and deadly disease. And in her case, it really was. And what happened to her was she got addicted to water. She discovered that if she drank very high volumes of water, she would become hyponatremic, which means that the sodium levels became abnormally low in her blood, which caused her to become altered. So she had then had an altered mental status, which is what she wanted. Again, she wanted to be out of herself, to be in a place of forgetting. And unfortunately, eventually, she ended up taking her life. So that was very sad. Now, that's an extreme example of somebody who was already severely addicted, who got addicted to water. But I use that example just to show that, once that kind of wiring gets set up, people are really vulnerable to getting addicted to pretty much anything.
I want to ask you if people with addictions realize they're addicted, but I know from reading your book that they do not know that. So are there any kind of tests that we can do ourselves or rules of thumb that we could use to realize if we are addicted to something?
Oh, well, I would qualify that by saying in the early stages of developing addiction, it's very insidious and most of us don't recognize it. And in the book, I talk about my own addiction to romance novels and how I didn't recognize it until later. But the truth is that many people with addiction, once it really blossoms, do recognize that they're addicted. And even then they can't necessarily stop, or they can't stop without help. And to me, that's really important and also fascinating, because it shows that even when we have insight into the self and other destructive qualities of the behavior, we still can't stop, which really speaks to the overwhelming physiologic changes in the brain driving this behavior.
So that leads to the next obvious question. How do you stop an addictive behavior?
So the thing that I recommend is that if you have a behavior that you're worried might be addictive, or even that you know is addictive, what you might do is start with a 30-day trial of abstinence, otherwise known as a dopamine fast. And what that allows is essentially it allows those neuroadaptation gremlins to hop off the pain side of the balance and for normal dopamine transmission to be restored, which is really important because it allows us to be less anxious, less depressed, less craving, and also to enjoy other things in our lives, which what happens in addiction is our focus becomes very narrowed on that one thing and nothing else is pleasurable. And then we convince ourselves that other things really aren't pleasurable to us, that we don't have interest in other things. But a 30-day dopamine fast allows dopamine neurotransmission to be restored to baseline levels, and for us to realize that, no, actually, I do have other interests. I do like these other things. Like, I thought my relationship, wasn't worth investing in, but it turns out it really is. I was just overly, focused on this other highly reinforcing behavior. The other really important piece of that dopamine fast is that it allows us to see true cause and effect, because when we're in our addiction, as Cameron was alluding to, it's hard to see the true impact of our addictive behavior on our lives. But when we stop, we can look back and say, oh my goodness, I hadn't really realized. And I've had many patients who come back and say, I barely even recognize that person who was doing those things. It seems so surreal and so far away from who I really am. And I find that always really powerful, because it just really speaks to this fact that when we're in that vortex of addiction, it has a life of its own, and we don't see it for what it is. And then after that dopamine fast, then we can choose whether we want to continue to abstain from our drug of choice, or whether we want to go back to using in moderation. And if we want to go back to using in moderation, how to do that.
Is that a real thing? Using in moderation after addiction?
Yes, it is a real thing. So we used to say that once a person was addicted, always addicted, they could never go back to using. But the alcohol addiction literature has shown that with a period of abstinence, there are some individuals who actually are able to return to using alcohol in moderation with a lot of effort. Let me emphasize again, with a lot of effort. So they have to put a lot of conscious effort, and they have to change their environment, and they have to actively engage in moderating. And sometimes people will say, it's not worth the effort, I'd rather abstain. Sometimes people will find that even with effort, they can't abstain and they relapse. And sometimes they relapse really hard, something called the abstinence violation effect, and they go back to using even harder. Again, those are all examples of people who probably in the long term cannot moderate. But it really is true that a moderation is possible for some people with intense effort after a period of abstinence. I also think it's important to highlight that there are some addictions that we simply can't choose to abstain from. For example, smartphone addiction. For most of us, we are required to have smartphones for our work. Food addiction, we can't not eat. Sex addiction, most of us would say that healthy sex is a good part of a healthy life. So I think the discussion of how to moderate has become really central today.
Fascinating. In our day jobs, Ben and I help people achieve long-term financial goals, which of course are often, competing with short-term dopamine-seeking behaviors that you mentioned earlier, like spending and gambling. So does this dopamine-rich world that you describe make long-term decision-making harder for people?
I think it really does. One of my neuroscience colleagues, he did a fascinating experiment where he showed that when people are engaging in a game or a task that involves short-term rewards, that the part of their brain that lights up most prominently is the limbic brain, or the emotion brain, which is exactly where this reward pathway, this pleasure-pain balance is located. When people are engaging in a task that requires them to think about and anticipate longer-term rewards, the part of their brain that lights up most is the prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is that big gray matter area right behind our foreheads that's central to delayed gratification, future consequences, storytelling, planning. So what that tells us is that we're engaging very different parts of our brain when we are anticipating short-term rewards versus long-term rewards. And that short-term rewards are especially dangerous because they do primarily engage our emotion brain. And when we're just living in emotion brain, we're probably not able to truly and objectively see future consequences. So I do think that in your work, it's very important, I would imagine, that you help people understand that they need to sit on those decisions. That this is something that they should give it 24 hours. They shouldn't do it impulsively or in the moment, although the pull to do it then is very, very strong, especially, again, if you add in the social media and the herd mentality factor where you see everybody else piling on. But I really think that there's a huge danger of not really objectively being able to engage the prefrontal cortex to see the true data and the true implication of that choice if we're just working out of our limbic brain.
It makes sense. You kind of want to step back and think rationally, so to speak. Is there anything that we can do to help make the longer term decision making feel more pleasurable?
Well, I think one thing to do, which I do with patients with addiction, is to think about values and living in line with our values, and having our values inform our decisions, as opposed to it just being, the monetary reward itself or the instant gratification. Another metacognitive strategy that I think is very effective, that I've learned from my patients and try to practice myself, is truth telling. So, what telling the truth about what we're doing, including about how we're investing, being able to, go to our loved ones later and say, I did this with our money, is also super important, because truth telling probably also activates the prefrontal cortex. And when that prefrontal cortex is upregulated and activated, it's able to then re-regulate the dopamine reward pathway. So I think metacognitive strategies like that, living according to our values, telling the truth, and being comfortable telling other people how and when and where and how much we invested. Those are kinds of metacognitive strategies that engage the prefrontal cortex that I think will help people make better choices. And I think that can be pleasurable too, right? Because when we're living according to our values, we have a certain respect for our moral selves that feels really good.
Something I've thought about a lot since reading your book is the pain side of the balance. And I listened to a podcast yesterday where the guest was talking about people should seek out pain more often and view pain as a bit of a reward. This is a business consultant. So the question for you is it possible to seek pleasure through pain?
Yes, it is. And it's a whole branch of science called hormesis. Hormesis is Greek for to set in motion. And I just love that terminology, because if you think again about the pleasure pain balance, remember when we pressed on the pleasure side, we got all those neuroadaptation gremlins on the pain side, and eventually we end up with a whole bunch of gremlins tilting our balance chronically to the side of pain. So we're in a depressed, anxious, and dopamine deficit state. Well, it turns out that if you press on the pain side of the balance as the initial stimulus, what you do is you trigger your body's own re-regulating homeostatic response. You start making more of your own dopamine. You start making more norepinephrine, more serotonin. So in fact, physiologically, it's a great way to get dopamine, because it's not from the initial stimulus, it's from the secondary re-regulating effect, which is a lot healthier and a lot more enduring, because it's not vulnerable to the same tolerance at the same rapid rate as those huge boluses of dopamine that we get when we do something that's immediately intoxicating. And let me just say, when I say pressing on the pain side of the balance, I'm speaking very broadly here of anything that's effortful. So this could be exercise, it could be an ice cold water bath, it could be doing something that's creative and challenging with the appropriate amount of frustration required. It could be reading a difficult text. It could be forcing yourself to do something that causes you anxiety or that you're afraid of. There's a wide range of things that are painful or hard to do, but what essentially happens is that it helps us build up the mental calluses to be more resilient in the face of future pain, and it also ultimately leads to more dopamine.
So a lot of people will say that volatility in their portfolios is painful. A past guest on our podcast, Dave Getch, talked about how he recommends people learn to hug volatility, learn to embrace volatility. It's a way of life. And once you get this framing around volatility, it won't be as painful going forward. Do you have any thoughts about that? Any advice you give to people who view volatility as pain?
I mean, so I'm not, an economist, or I don't have the expertise that you have. So I wouldn't want to say, I don't know what volatility would imply about the investment, But I can certainly say that the idea of embracing and welcoming things that are uncomfortable for us or that we would normally shirk away from is a very Buddhist idea, and it's really at the heart of the whole idea of the neuroscience of pain and pleasure. Because when we're constantly trying to run away from things that are painful or uncomfortable, trust me, we can never run far enough. It will always catch up with us. But if we stop and turn and face it and really kind of just look at it and be curious about it and think of it as an opportunity to learn something about ourselves, to learn something about the world, to develop more resilience because we are building up mental calluses because we're just tolerating that uncomfortable feeling. That certainly is something that neuroscience would support and something that I've seen in my clinical practice help build resilience and happiness.
Wow. You touched briefly earlier on leisure time. The world's getting better over the last couple of 100 years. The world's gotten a lot better, I think, for most people. Is the increase in leisure time a good thing for people?
Great question. I think that we haven't yet figured out how to handle all of the time that we have. So not only are we seeing increases in leisure time, so the average person today has, I think, something like 4 to 5 hours of leisure time per day. In 100, 150 years ago, it was more like 1 or 2 hours a day. And at that time, there were people who had no leisure time, right? People who worked 24/7, people who worked and lived in slavery. In 2025 or 2050, we're projected to have even more leisure time. We're some 7 or 8 hours of leisure time today. People talk about the universal basic income, that we would give people an income such that they wouldn't have to work at all and they could have a subsistence living. The problem is that we need to be much more thoughtful about how we're using this leisure time, because as of right now, it looks like we're mainly using it to consume highly rewarding feel-good drugs and behaviors. So one statistic that was really powerful for me is that we've seen an exodus of young men out of the workforce. There are fewer young men employed and working today than in many prior generations. And what they're mostly lost to is video games. So we really have this situation where people are working less, but they don't know what to do with that extra time. And many of them are using that time to engage in these highly reinforcing escapist behaviors that ultimately, I think, will make them very unhappy and that are fundamentally addictive. So I'm concerned. Also, we're living longer, right? I mean, the average human lived to about age 30 for most of human existence. Now we're living on average to age 80. So we've got more time on any given day. We've got more days. I'm seeing more and more people in retirement coming in with new onset addiction of all sorts. People who could drink alcohol in moderation through their whole lives, retire, have all this time, and then all of a sudden drinking all day long, and then cross that physiologic threshold, get dependent, experience withdrawal, are really in full-blown addiction. And of course, the danger there is further that as we age, our brains get less plastic. And so these habits that we've, that we're creating later in life, it's harder to undo them. So this is, I think, something we need to collectively really think about.
It sounds like the universal basic income idea solves an economic problem, but potentially creates some other pretty significant problems to deal with.
Yes, I think so. I mean, when I read The Economists, what I find fascinating is that although we have a very serious income gap, there's actually a smaller income gap between rich and poor in rich nations than ever before in human history. Plus, even the poorest of the poor have more access to luxury consumer goods than ever before. So we have this sort of terrible situation where people living in poverty today, who are at risk for all kinds of social ills and mental illness, including addiction, because of poverty and unemployment, are also at increased risk because of the increased access to these, highly addictive drugs and behaviors. So I really think that poor people living in rich nations are some of the highest risk people on the planet.
So you mentioned retirement earlier. How should someone preparing for retirement think about what they will do, or just think about the extra time they're going to have on their hands so they don't end up in some sort of problematic environment?
The number one message I would want to communicate to people in retirement is for them to recognize that Netflix and social media and other online activities are drugs, that these are addictive, and that if we engage too much and too often, we will get into this dopamine deficit state where our drive to use is driven not by the joy of the behavior itself, but by being in a dopamine deficit state and just trying to get out of those universal symptoms of withdrawal, anxiety, irritability, insomnia, depression. I really worry about the number of older people I am seeing who are spending enormous amounts of time online, spending less and less time in real life with other people, and essentially meeting their all of their sort of cognitive, social, emotional needs, through the computer. I think that's really, really dangerous. I mean, all good things in moderation. It's not that none of it's good, but even like in retirement homes now, where I go visit, people are not socializing, as they used to, because they don't have to. They can be in their little individual honeycombs, watching a show, and I'm really worried about that.
You mentioned a couple times seeing more retired people as patients. Is it largely social media addiction, or is it all kinds that you're seeing?
All kinds of addiction, especially alcohol and cannabis. So what is most prevalent is baby boomers, who used alcohol and cannabis in reasonable moderation through most of their adult lives and were able to moderate and handle it, who then, as they age, either because they have more time or because something happens in the brain, just like any muscle. The brain also is a type of a muscle that can get tired as we get older and work less well. And so whatever limiting or moderating strategies they had before stop working or don't work as well. And then that can trip them over into excessive, compulsive, addictive use. And also keep in mind that all drugs now are more potent. So you've got baby boomers, who used 9% THC cannabis in the 70s, who are now dabbing, 90% THC, and then they can't figure out why they're, miserable and why they can't stop using. Right. So it's all of those things converging at once.
Speaking of convergence, how has the pandemic affected all of this?
Pandemic's been fascinating. I think there's really very much like two populations that I've seen. People who have found that the pandemic and quarantine in particular has been a very positive experience for them, and people for whom the pandemic has been very negative in terms of compulsive overconsumption. So I'll just briefly describe that. I have many patients who have told me that the pandemic was just a godsend in terms of reducing triggers. Not going out to the grocery store, to parties, to social events, to dinners made it so much easier for them to abstain or limit their use because they weren't constantly being subjected to invitations to use. I had one patient who said, my biggest trigger is actually my car. When I get in my car, I want to drive to the places I usually get drugs and use. And with quarantine, I haven't been in my car in months, and it's been such a wonderful respite from craving and triggers for me. So that's been really interesting and fascinating to see. On the other hand, I have a patient population, especially those living in isolation, living alone, who lost human contact, even basic human touch. Many of those people found it extremely difficult, and some of them relapsed. And then there's a third population of folks who were using in moderation pre-pandemic, and then quarantine found them eating more, drinking more, online more, and developing addictions for the first time to things like food, alcohol, and social media.
Just back on the leisure time idea, you mentioned for people retiring that to be aware of the fact that social media and Netflix can be addictive. Is there anything else people can do to avoid the negative impacts of too much leisure time? Is hobbies or anything like that a way to solve that problem?
Yeah, thanks so much for circling back to that, because I should have said that before, that basically there are a lot of things that you do. I think that you can do. First is, again, just the awareness that it's very easy to get addicted to stuff we're seeing online, as well as more traditional drugs, alcohol, cannabis, and to really limit quantity and frequency. So if you're going to use those drugs, use them intermittently and use them for limited quantities and limited duration, so that you give enough time for your pleasure pain balance to restore homeostasis in between use. That's really key. The second thing is that, yes, essentially by engaging in hormesis, or things that are hard or challenging as a source of dopamine, that's really the way to go, including in retirement. So yes, hobbies, difficult reading, gardening, cooking, anything that requires effort and anything for which the dopamine is delayed or secondary. Those are the kinds of things that I think really in retirement we can engage in with impunity. We don't really have to limit those. What we have to be wary of is those substances and those behaviors that make us instantly feel good. It's okay to use them, just need to use them in extreme moderation.
Fascinating. Can you describe the relationship between radical honesty and dopamine?
Yeah, so radical honesty is the idea of going through the whole day without telling a single lie about anything. Turns out this is really hard. It's one of the effortful things that we can try to do as a source of dopamine. And the reason it's hard is because we're all natural liars. The average person tells 1.5 fibs per day, and we're just prone to do that. Usually these are little lies. They're not a big deal. Oh, I'm sorry I was late for the meeting. Traffic is bad. Instead of, oh, I'm sorry I was late for the meeting, I wanted 5 more minutes to drink my coffee and read the paper. But the thing about lies is this is something that I've learned from my patients, and the neuroscience backs it up, is that lying contributes to our tendency to want quick fixes and fast rewards. And telling the truth helps us delay gratification and engages the prefrontal cortex so that we're more able to delay those kinds of rewards. And there are a number of interesting experiments which have shown this. So for example, there's an experiment where subjects were asked to engage in a die rolling task, where the computer generated the die roll that would lead to a monetary reward. And then the subjects would have to say on their die roll whether or not they got what the computer said. And, people lied. I mean, people lied about 60% of the time. They lied and said they got what the monetary reward die roll instead of what they really got. And the researchers knew that because they just compared it against the 50% benchmark that you would expect from the probability of getting that die roll. But then very interestingly, what the researchers did was they used transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is a way of creating an electrical field around the brain to stimulate parts of the brain with electricity. And they used TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, to stimulate the prefrontal cortex. Remember, the prefrontal cortex is a big gray matter right behind the forehead. That is the part of our future planning, delayed gratification, storytelling. And what they found was that when they used this stimulator machine to stimulate the prefrontal cortex, patients or subjects who did that same exact die rolling task lied less. So in other words, just by stimulating the prefrontal cortex, they got people to be more truthful, which is really, really interesting. And it led me to hypothesize that if stimulating the prefrontal cortex makes people tell the truth, could telling the truth stimulate the prefrontal cortex? So I asked the neuroscientist who did that experiment whether he thought that was possible, and he said he thought it was, through this simple idea that what wires together fires together. And it really is consistent with what I've seen, with people who get into recovery from addiction, that when they're in good, robust recovery, they tell the truth about almost everything, or they try to, and that they will endorse truth telling as key to their ability to maintain abstinence and not relapse. And once they start lying and they get into the lying habit, they're very likely to relapse. Because when people are in their addiction, they're not just lying about their drug use, they start lying about everything. I had a patient say to me that when he was in his addiction, if he was at Burger King and a friend called him, he'd say he was at McDonald's. When he was at McDonald's, he'd say he was at Burger King. It didn't even make any sense, right? But he was just in the lying habit. And so telling the truth was, I think it's a way to reactivate the prefrontal cortex and allow us to better engage and communicate the prefrontal cortex to the reward pathway.
Wow.
As you were talking just now, I started to wonder something. Is there a relationship between pain and activating the prefrontal cortex?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think what the way to think about this is that when our brains are functioning in a healthy way, the prefrontal cortex is communicating actively with our dopamine reward pathway. And what happens in addiction is that we essentially cut off that communication, and our dopamine reward pathway just basically gets a life of its own, and it's reflexively doing its pleasure pain thing. So if we force ourselves to willfully do things that are hard and press on the pain side of the balance, already right there, we're engaging the prefrontal cortex because we're going against the natural impulse, which is to just do things that are pleasurable and avoid pain. Remember, we have evolved over millions of years to approach pleasure and avoid pain, and it's what kept us alive in a world of scarcity and ever-present danger. The problem is that we don't live in that world. We live in this world of overwhelming abundance. So we really have to consciously and with intention recreate a world of scarcity and a world of danger. And we can do that by intentionally doing things that are hard, doing things that are painful. And I do think that that then allows our prefrontal cortex to reactivate and re-engage with those dopamine reward pathways. Also, it's a good source of dopamine.
I have a question back to radical honesty, and I'm curious how you think it might extend to how parents talk to their kids about things like the household finances.
Yeah, so I'm really into what I'll call transparent parenting. I think that we can think as parents that if we present ourselves as, morally perfect and good, that we will then serve as role models for our kids. But I don't think that that really works. I think instead, our kids are going to learn from our mistakes, and we're much better off being transparent about our own foibles, flaws, errors, and just general struggling, so that they know they're not the only one, and that they feel that the family unit is a place where they can bring those struggles. And I think that applies equally well to financial struggles or financial worries. I also think it's really good early on to talk to kids and give them an education about finances. When I was raised, I didn't get that, and I came into adulthood really knowing nothing about money or how to manage it. I had sort of an intuitive sense, but just because of my beliefs about truth telling and parenting and transparent parenting, I do think that it's very, very good to let kids in early, not just with your financial successes, but also your financial failures and what went wrong. And, we have done that with our children, gotten them going early with their own money that they need to be responsible for, that they can invest and lose without coming to rescue them if that's what's going to happen. And just being, honest about the struggles that we all face and feel about finances.
Can a little bit of shame be a good thing to avoid unwanted behaviors?
So shame is fundamentally our strongest pro-social emotion. It actually is the fundamental social emotion. We experience shame when we do something that is not consistent with group norms. And shame comes as a powerful gut punch of an emotion and a huge amount of fear that we will be shunned from our tribe. So I think that an appropriate amount of shame is really positive and really good, as long as it's not excessive and as long as the person who is shamed has a pathway for redemption. So, for example, in raising children, I think it's important to let kids know when they have erred and when they have done something that they should be ashamed of. It doesn't mean wagging your finger at them and, making them feel like dirt, but it certainly means acknowledging, hey, this was a wrong thing. Or, they'll come back and they'll say, oh, the coach said this to me, about being late. Or my teacher said this to me about, this assignment. It's like, well, sounds like your teacher was right. You were late for practice, or yeah, it sounds like you doesn't look like you put much effort into that assignment. So really validating what's true and real about the source of the shame, while at the same time trying to create a solution-based pathway for that person to do better next time.
We talked about spending being potentially addictive earlier, which can often be a source of frustration or disagreement in relationships with spouses. Where would the balance be between pro-social shame and destructive shame if a couple has agreed, like, hey, you're going to stop spending on whatever something is? Where is that balance?
Well, I mean, I think, the couple has agreed is the key point there. If the couple has come together and made, an agreement about how they're going to spend their money, and then a person in that couple deviates from that agreement, that person should feel shame simply from the deviating from the agreed upon contract. If that person wants to renegotiate the agreed upon contract, okay, that's something different. But the trust is broken when we promise to do something and then we break that promise. One of the experiments I talk about in my book is the Stanford marshmallow experiment, and how these kids were given a marshmallow and told, hey, if you can wait in this room for 15 minutes, we'll give you a second. Without eating the first marshmallow, we'll give you a second marshmallow. And what they found is that the older the kid was, the more likely they could delay gratification for a second marshmallow. And then some kids were just better at it than others. But a very interesting twist on this experiment was they told some kids, if you ring that bell, I'll come back in before the 15 minutes is over. And for some of those kids, when they rang the bell, they went back in. And for another set of those kids, when they rang the bell, they didn't go back in. So they lied to those kids. Those kids were less likely to be able to wait the full 15 minutes than the kids who were told the truth. So in other words, when people lie to us, it creates a sense of scarcity, even in the absence of scarcity, which then makes us favor short-term rewards. So if you have a couple lying to each other, or one person deviating from an agreed upon contract, I would not be at all surprised then if the other spouse goes out and spends a bunch of money on something else, right? Because it's this sense of scarcity. I can't trust the world and other people to be the place that I thought it was going to be, or for that person to do what they said they were going to do. And then that feeds right into craving and our desire for our own immediate gratification, which is really important because we are living in this place of overwhelming abundance here in the United States. And yet so many people feel a sense of scarcity. And I think it has to do with the lying, all of the lying. People feel they can't rely on each other and they can't rely on the world. So if we could just tell the truth, then maybe people would feel better about, not instantly gratifying their desires.
Wow. Speaking of scarcity, it's too bad we're out of time. I'm sure Ben and I could ask you questions all afternoon, but we've come to our final and one of our favorite questions, which is, Anna, how do you define success in your life?
I define success mostly around trying to be the best parent that I can be. And then I would say on a deeper philosophical level, and trying to be a good doctor too. My patients are kind of like my kids. And then every day I try to seek a way of being in the world that allows me to forget about me and see it as not about me, but as about trying to do some good in the world that really isn't even from me, but is from some deeper life force, a good force in the world that I think we can all tap into. And that is how I define success.
Wow, what a beautiful answer. And this has been a great hour. Anna, thanks so much. I'm so happy that you agreed to join us. And this has been an incredibly, safe to say, important conversation. So thank you.
Oh, well, thank you. You're very welcome. It's been a joy for me. You've had great questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much. That was great.
You're very welcome. It's been my pleasure.